Hi, everybody. Sorry for the long wait on this particular one. I've had quite the task of cropping this together, but I am pretty excited to get going with this new process video. Uh, this time around, I wanted to explore kind of the beginning to end of the process of adapting a really graphic two-dimensional design and the thinking of a two-dimensional design, like Hilda's, um, into a more rounded dimensional finished product and all the steps from one to the next. In doing so, I tried to record my entire process in its full length without exporting like what is usually a really sped up video from Procreate, and kind of failed pretty terrifically in getting a clean recording of that. So my apologies if this is a little choppy as we go through. I did my best to try and get it all, and I'll try to explain and smooth over the bits that might not be as clear. So what you see me doing here at the beginning, and some of this I've done just for the benefit of you guys watching, and I want to break down kind of the thinking process visually, and a lot of this I wouldn't normally do for myself, but it's definitely helpful if you're trying to get your head around it and learn. And this actually I sometimes will do, depending on the design and the assignment. But what you're seeing is I'm just sort of looking over the two-dimensional design and tracing over the whole thing with my own lines, just to kind of explore Hilda's design on my own terms and start to understand her shapes and proportions. So what I want to do is create an illustration with her where I'm going to pose her and then sort of explore what she would look like in 3D. And both of those things involve really understanding the proportions and the form of the original design to pull off convincingly. So to do that, I've just created a new layer and sort of uh, drawn on top of it without destroying the thing underneath. And here I'm trying to inspect, like, okay, these are the basic 2D contour forms, the things that you take for granted that are just sort of presented as flat. Um, as I'm looking at this and analyzing it, my mind is sort of racing around. Okay, so she's got this very boxy kind of voluminous clothing. Um, when thinking about how she would move in 3D and where to put her arms and legs relative to each other, it's kind of important to visualize, like, okay, what's the body like underneath all the costuming? Um, how can you move from what's a really sort of iconic two-dimensional representation of this character into something that has a little bit more volume? And I think the answer to that is to look at each thing and kind of assess like where some of the problems are going to lie and what some of the things are um, that you really can't do in uh, 3D or 3D sort of volumetric drawings that you can always do in 2D. So right here I'm highlighting a couple of those things. Those gaps in orange by the eyeballs, as well as the overlaps in the armpit. They're interesting points of data, but they're definitely sort of helping teach me about the dimension, but while at the same time implying certain things about the form uh, subtly. So you're looking for those hints, trying to understand what things are going to connect and how you're going to follow through with it as you push it further forward. Um, you might understand from the sort of contour of the brow, the shape of a cheek, uh, sort of between those two things, you start to sort of construct in your head. That's why I'm drawing this mesh over it, that there's a sense of volume and dimension that's implied even by these really, really simple lines. Um, you might look at this character's hair and see the volumes. It's hard to tell exactly what shape that would translate to in 3D, and some of these things are challenging. So you might not know, are those one mass or two masses? How complex do you want to interpret this thing as you move forward? All of these sort of like techniques of throwing a sort of a mesh, kind of a grid across something and looking at how the lines bend can be helpful tools in terms of just helping you to visualize how dimension is going to affect a design once it's translated up from that. One of the things I wanted to talk about in this video as well is like the use and function of line art, and that might be another video entirely. We'll see how this one goes, but I've always found that line art is definitely the first thing we're usually drawn to in our work. At least that's how I began. I began sketching with lines and crayons. But it's important to realize that all line art is a kind of an abbreviation. It's kind of a shorthand, because in real life there are no lines. In real life, your hand is just a mass of volume and color. And at the edge, there's no physical outline sort of delineating it. There's just the color of the wall in the distance behind it, and our eyes are used to understanding sort of volume and sense of space between those two things in a variety of ways. And we sort of establish that. And lines, in their nature, kind of are almost like a visual slang, kind of a way of really quickly and really clearly showing where one thing ends and the other thing begins. And that could be a really big challenge when you're considering moving to a lineless style or trying out lineless painting. Lines often are very explicit and a very quick, expedient, and really useful, sometimes very beautiful shorthand to explain what's going on in a drawing dimensionally. And as you move away from that, you're approaching something that's a little more like the things we really see. The way that you draw these things and the way that they're placed become more important. There's less of an ability for you to get away with the things that you might get away with in line art. You have to really think about what is the physical volume all the way around this hairstyle, this ear that I'm drawing, the exterior and interior of a mouth, the orbs of the eyes. Whereas you might just draw a circle before, or kind of broken lines that kind of define the top lashes and the bottom lashes. Now you're looking and thinking a little more analytically about where that sits in space, and in space in relation to the cheek and the eye socket and the eyebrow. All of that starts to become important. I think one of the reasons I started to move towards a lineless style, and there were quite a few, was that I was passing off all of this work to 3D modelers who then were going to need to take what I had drawn and interpret that in a sculpture program, and then building from there and increasing complexity to make things that would show up in the final show or game or toy. And I realized that some of the shortcuts I had built into my line art that made sense to me were kind of shooting me in the foot when it came to passing on that line art to somebody who was going to sculpt it. It's not always easy for somebody else to interpret what you mean when you sort of draw a particular shape that makes sense to you when it's flat, but when they start to sculpt it in 3 dimensions, it just doesn't quite work out the way you thought it was. And that's really because of that abstraction and the shortcut nature of lines that I've been talking about. So I think that it's extremely useful, even if you love line and you never want to move away from it or try something else, to still give volumetric painting a try, because it is going to help you understand the shapes and volumes that you're drawing when you draw with line. And if you are lucky to then move into a space where you're working with a 3D artist, it's going to make you a lot more pleasant to work with. And instead of handing off, if you've ever seen those MC Escher knots, the kind of impossible geometry stuff that lends itself to, what was that video game? There's an app. I'll put it in the notes of the video. I've completely blanked on it. But the things that are possible as visual illusions in 2D that once you hand them off to a 3D modeling artist are just frustrating. So right here, what I've been doing is, now that I've mapped out the sort of neutral pose of the character, I've understood by running my own lines all around the design, what the shapes and proportions are, the basic volumes. Now I'm trying to move Hilda into a couple different poses and kind of figure out what it is that I want to draw with this illustration and the kind of interaction that I want to have. And a lot of considerations go into that: what kind of tone and mood, who the character is, what their relationship to an environment or background is going to be. Uh, but for right now, it's just purely exploratory, and you'll see the way that I'm sketching is very loose with a larger brush, and I'm keeping to the basic shapes of the character. I'm always starting with sort of the spherical bean for the head, building the back of the skull on a little bit so I understand where that sits, then building the sort of cylinder of her torso, the big sort of soft wrap of her scarf off of that, and kind of working down the spine of the character, essentially, kind of creating this core, and then I can build the legs and arms off of that in a way that makes sense. There's no hard rule here. Everybody has their own way of beginning a drawing and beginning to understand a character vis-a-vis their anatomy and just the way that it naturally comes to you to draw. And this will even change for me from drawing to drawing, but I find that, especially when I'm trying to figure out volume as I am here, oops, at least a little behind the scenes there. When I'm trying to figure out volume, it really helps to think about those basic shapes and look at them in their sort of most elemental form. You see this in a lot of how to draw books. Not everybody then uses that method, but I still do. I still use the sort of basic volume approach to the work that I do. It's more posing. Still haven't quite found the right sense of energy, and I really want to get the full sense of the character because I really love this show. And by the way, so if you don't have no idea what I'm drawing here, this character, her name is Hilda. There's a show out on Netflix just recently. It's just a wonderful cartoon, and it's based on a series of wonderful comics by a guy named Luke Pearson that I just super heartily recommend. He's a great comic author and does beautiful work with visual storytelling. If you're ever interested in seeing how somebody can kind of command the graphic layout of a page to tell a story, Luke Pearson's a great one to look at. And his comics, the Hilda comics, got adapted into an animated show. And it's about this young girl exploring this world full of sort of hidden creatures and adventures, some of which only she can see. And the nature of the world is kind of very quirky and delightful. And the music's great, and the color palettes are really beautiful, as you could probably see from those reference images I have here in the file. Keeping reference images on hand is always really key for me as well. Sometimes it's good to put them away and kind of just focus on my own thoughts and approach to the piece, but often it's really good to have reference images just readily there, so as I'm drawing, instead of just tracing at this point, I have it right there so I can look and see and make sure that what I'm doing feels about right. Now, I've had to speed up some of these chunks of video because my actual process is hours long, and I really wanted to show it fully here, but that means speeding up, and that also in this case means zooming in and out, so I hope none of you are getting too seasick. The eyes are really important. It's one of the things as I start to refine the line art and the character design, I pay close attention to the eyes. Eyes are usually something we're going to look at really immediately. They give us a sense of the emotion of the character. I mean, I don't have to tell you this. Usually everybody is pretty drawn to drawing eyeballs from a very early stage, no matter what. One of the things I found as I went was that certain proportions of her eyes, specifically the size of her pupils relative to the size of the orb of her eyes, that work really well in 2D. I like the proportion of the real small kind of oval shape. Didn't work as well once the whole thing was sort of created in volume, and you'll see, I'll come back to that later. but I had to size up those pupils a little bit so that the proportion felt more natural as the volume was increased. And there's a lot of little moments like that going through this process of realizing that some things just are not going to translate as elegantly into sort of a 3D approach um, as others might. So here I'm really figuring out and exploring as I go uh, how much detail to add, and I love the simplicity and the elegance of her design for the show, and I really want to preserve that and make it look as on model as possible. Um, but I also want to add just little bits of detail without pushing it too far over into territory where it starts to lose that charm. So even here, you can see down the leg, I'm looking at like sort of just a hint of anatomy that she has more of a calf. Her leg gets a little chunky as it goes along. There's like sort of slight folds in her boots, little details of kind of the crinkles of a sweater sleeve, at her cuffs as well. And those little hints, and it's a very tricky balance if you've ever tried to adapt something very simple, the amount of detail you want to put in it. It's super subjective and everybody has a different approach. Um, if you've been on the Discord, you know I'm no big fan of the look of Detective Pikachu, and the sort of photorealistic approach to more elegant 2D design is not my fave. But that's a very personal thing, and it just comes down to what your preferences are and what your goals are for the piece. Um, Here I am trying to figure out those pupils and place them so that they look like they're really focusing on some point in the distance, and they're both looking in the actual exact same direction. That's another thing that eyes particularly difficult to translate from 2D into 3D when it's just line art. Um, you're seeing things that uh, feel about right to you, but as soon as you start to add color, you start to understand the distances and the exact shapes of eyeballs and skin, and everything starts to become clear. And sometimes what becomes clear is that they look insane. Their eyes are looking in different directions. Backing up really quick, you just saw me play with the arm. I flipped the canvas, and I've been doing that throughout the process a little bit. I think that's an important thing to realize and practice, is your interpretation of it from one angle versus your interpretation from another are going to be very different. You're going to see new things, and in this instance I saw that her arms didn't match in terms of scale and size. So here I'm diagramming for you a little bit about her hair. So her hair is a very abstract thing, and I'm trying to understand with these lines and show you, I wouldn't do this myself, but I'm trying to show how I'm visualizing the flow of her hair. In order to do that, I'm showing as though if it were strands that were rendered individually, how the volume would work out. And I'm using that strand pattern, the way that the hair would flow if I were really upping the detail, to guide the simpler, sort of more abstract kind of toy style volumes that I'm actually going to be painting in. So it really helps to understand hair, even if what you're going to do is just sort of a abstract blue blob. The shapes and the way that that blue blob actually sit and flow, in this instance, are definitely influenced by my understanding of how her hair might flow if it were more realistic. So sorry about the speed of this. It's just there's so much video to get through, and I know this is pretty herky-jerky. But trying to work on her little fox companion. Deer fox, my bad. And he's such a tricky one because, again, it's a design that has so much appeal in its simplest form. And as you start to move it around and shift his head and move it in relation to his torso, some things are really easy to lose, and the sense of cuteness and rightness, and I don't want to add too much detail, and it's always so easy to add more detail, more anatomy to these characters. My hand is trained to want to do that. And part of this process is just resisting that history of upping the amount of anatomy and trying to get things right as simply as possible. It's a lot easier to make something look right if you add more grit and detail on lines. But the tricky thing about doing something with less detail is that all of the subtle flaws are hidden, but super noticeable. You can't tell exactly what's wrong, but you can tell it's wrong. And you're not sure why it's wrong because there's not a lot of information. But that's always a big struggle. All right, so now we've calmed down on the camera thing, switched over to a sort of speed version of the whole process from here, and then I'll go back into a slightly slower version of the same and talk about it. But this is the sped up exported video without the zooming in and out. So this doesn't precisely show the zooming in, the zooming out, the fine detailing, and it's definitely very sped up. I find that people seem to think sometimes that the videos I post online are representative of the actual speed of the work I do, but that's not true at all. We're looking at a minimum of 5 or 6 hours on a piece like this, and probably a good deal more. And I can't keep talking for 5 or 6 hours about all this stuff. And that's what's so difficult about making these, is that I want to do it live while I'm drawing so I can explain, but the process, when it's really its fullest self, really takes a long time, and usually is best done in silence with a sort of concentration. So my apologies if this is a bit of a compromise, but so I'm still living in sort of a mostly two-dimensional world at this stage. I'm filling in all the flat colors and starting to explore, with this I need to define exactly where the white of the eye begins and ends. I can't be super vague with, the contours of these shapes. I want to make sure that the exact shapes are where I want them to be, so that at the end they're going to look right. The background detailing, I just wanted to do kind of a soft focus thing, and I may well do another video about kind of creating the illusion of soft focus, because that's something I've been playing around with recently that I've had a lot of fun with. And that helps to create the illusion of depth, sort of this camera lens effect, where just the character and the immediate environment sort of around them on that plane in space is in focus, and everything in the distance is increasingly less in focus, and everything sort of super, super close up to us is also thrown out of focus as well. So here we're getting into the actual volumetric shading and shaping. After having sketched it multiple times, sort of run my pencil across the design and explored sort of like, okay, so I know this sort of bean shape of the face. Now I understand like the shape of the nose I'm going for. Also kind of a bean within a bean. Really little detail on the ears. I just want the slightest sort of indication of an indentation. And I've gone over the hair, and now I understand, okay, well, this is where that's going to sort of flow up to, and then I'm going to turn the corner. And understanding that through the sketching process makes the shading and volume rendering so much easier and more pleasant. But I think it's really important for me to do my prep work and my homework before I just jump in, because sometimes that can be scary. And if you haven't practiced a lot, then jumping right into trying to figure out the volume as you go without really thinking about it and planning for it to begin with can stick you in a pickle. So this stage is an interesting one, and what it's called, now that I'm doing this sort of second layer of soft shading, that's called ambient occlusion. It's not precisely that. I don't do it by the sort of technical book. There's some artists, a guy that goes by the moniker Art Samich. I'm not sure his name off the top of my head, but a couple people who really do ambient occlusion versus sort of just the lit volume. And I can explain that a little more as we go on, what that is. But essentially ambient occlusion is the shadows that are so deep that no matter what the lighting is, from what angle, they're always going to be dark. So that's like in the most thin and sort of deep crevices and corners, sort of in this instance where her chin sort of overlaps her scarf overlaps her sweater, where her legs go into her boots. Those are spaces where almost from any angle where you put your light source, those are still going to be dark because of the nature of the overlap. It's usually called ambient occlusion. So doing that in a separate layer and having kind of those two layers of shading, one that's definitely affected by the environment and a second layer that's like very specific to the design and its folds and crannies, can be very helpful. So then another big part of my process, once I've gotten those two layers of shading done, is sort of the rim lighting that I throw in. And I have a love-hate relationship with rim lighting, especially when I'm doing something this simple. I feel like sometimes it can become tacky and throw too much volume into something, if not handled well. And if it doesn't look right, then it looks pretty wrong. So I try to be delicate with the way I do rim lighting. And I think that I find in her hair I have a little too much of it, and you may see me go back and take some of that back out. It's always a dance with just how much, and there's that pupil change in size, and I think definitely a good call. It was my wife's note, and it helps a lot. Just like flipping the canvas helps you get a fresh perspective on what you're drawing. Sometimes just passing it to a friend, somebody you trust who's visually tuned in, just having them look at it can make a world of difference, where they just say, oh, she's so good, but one note, the pupils are so small, she looks a little crazy. At this point, I actually started to sort of being comfortable with her, and the basics of the environment. I wanted to see how many sort of secret extra things I could sneak in. So, funnily enough, the wafts, the big sort of ochre-colored sphere creatures that are floating by, were this like super last-minute addition, but I think they really activate the piece and help create a sense of space. And I'm obsessed with super graphic white text titles. Of course, Al Fernie needed to make his way in there somewhere. So I popped him on the letter D. And because this is just the whole canvas, more or less, it's hard to see me shade him. Here's me going back into that, the process of flats, and how I'm approaching that. Apologize for the aspect ratio changing again. This is just another factor of how tricky it is to wrangle this process together, because I'm tilting my iPad multiple directions and trying to remember to hit record every time I sit down to work on it. And I promise I'll try and get better at this when I'm doing it. You see me zooming in and out a lot. That never comes out in the final exported videos, but the live screen recordings like this one, just another way, just like flipping the canvas, just like passing it to my wife, that I use to get a clearer sense of what's going on, where the shapes are hitting, whether everything is the correct size and sort of volume. And you'll see as you look at those layers, every local color, so her eyes, her hair, her scarf, they're all on their own layer. I do that, it's just a one method that I use to keep things kind of clean and manageable, and so that if I know something's off or the balance isn't quite working right between the colors, I can adjust one group of colors that are all the same or similar in one direction together. And that way I can, if I want to change something about the scarf, I can just adjust that layer specifically. Having a little trouble there rotating the iPad. Sometimes the UI will decide that I've changed position when I haven't. Cool thing about the iPad is that if I'm remembering correctly, I think I was on a flight to Nashville when I was doing this particular part of the drawing. And here, yeah, you can't tell, maybe it's pretty subtle, but I'm adjusting the color of her sweater and boots, sort of the peachy red. I want to get like a little bit of that pinkiness, but also the orange, just trying to get it just right. And you'd think you could just color sample from the reference images, and sometimes that works great, but sometimes it really doesn't. And as you start to change other things, you realize that, as the shapes change and your own drawing comes into it, sometimes you need to move the colors a little left or right of what was in the original reference material. And funnily enough, that is part of that is to maintain the sense of the character and keep them on model and feeling correct. Whereas if you just color sampled, sometimes the feeling just isn't the same. You look at the end product, and even though you use the color picker the entire time, the visuals have changed somewhere in between, and it's hard to know exactly how. So now the shading process, and I've talked about this in other videos, but what I do first with something like this, especially with someone like Hilda, because her volumes are so big and graphic, by which I mean her face is just all one big bean, kind of rounded bean shape. Her scarf creates one big sort of uh, what's the word? Cylindrical volume around her neck. Yeah, that'll do. A lot of cylinders going on, a lot of nice big clean shapes, and I want to first and foremost define those big volumes. Before I get lost in the detail, I want to make sure that those big soft shapes are clear. So I go in with large brushes, soft brush and the oval sketch brush, and I bring those in one at a time and kind of start to sculpt. And I think kind of contradicting myself here, but I'm going in and detailing a little bit about the scarf as I go. But this is a little closer to real time in terms of the time spent adjusting and fooling with shadows, trying to get it just right. This part, once I've got all the contours and shapes of the colors down, this part is quite fun for me, actually, because I can focus purely on volume. And because they're all on separate layers and I'm using a multiply layer mode to create the volume in the drawing, I'm able to think just about the shading and the shadows instead of worrying about destroying the layers underneath it. I believe I talk about it in the color basics video, but keeping those layers separate in the way that I do set them up, for me has just been a super useful way to sort through it. I think everybody finds the way that makes sense to them to structure their layers and to create a workflow that's like peaceful and pleasant that you understand. For me, this has become the way I do it. And one of the reasons I mentioned earlier that I started to move away from line as my primary style for at least a while, and I still go back to it and use it, and maybe it'll return more meaningfully in the future, uh, is that the inking process for me became more and more obsessive, and the tiny, finicky nature of getting those lines just right. And they're so precise, and that my hands would cramp and sort of get really tight a lot. My wrists would hurt more, and I found that moving into a more of a volume approach let me make bigger brush strokes, and something about even just creating these shapes that are sort of contours cramps my hand a little bit less. There's still moments when it's a struggle, but I found that creating perfect inked lines became a confining feature of my workflow for a while, and when you feel trapped in a particular method, that's never fun. You never want to feel like you can't get out of the process that you've committed to. So there's no one single process and there's no one right way. And if you watch this video and you conclude, like, I just love lines and I want to only do drawings with lines, that's great. And I find that they're still the most useful thing for getting ideas out quickly. Because as you can see, especially right now, the process of creating volume and the illusion of volume, at least sort of polished volume, is quite slow. And getting the same level of clear communication is much quicker with line. I can visually communicate, okay, her hand is this shape, her face is this shape, this is the pose. In line, I mean, sort of 20 minutes back in this video, we would have been done. If that was all I was trying to communicate to the viewer, then I wouldn't have to have gone much further than this. But working in volume helps to give it that much more information. And it depends on your viewer and your goals, but especially when you're thinking about concept art for games or movies or TV shows that are modeling things in 3D, it can be very helpful to cultivate just a sense of how that works and is going to be. Now, there are line artists whose line art is very tuned to 3D naturally. It's hard to explain, and maybe at some point I'll trot out a couple examples of how that looks, but I think you can tell when someone's really classically trained, when they've drawn a lot from life, when they have understood or the sculptural pipeline and the way that sculptors look and work, and maybe they are a sculptor themselves, and even in their simple work, there's an understanding and an acknowledgement of dimension and volume. Trying to summon an example to mind. I think a lot of animators understand this. Certain styles of animation preserve the volumes, the classic 2D Disney looks, when they're at their best. Some of the sort of classic Nine Old Men examples. I think Milt Kahl is the right name. He's springing to mind. Has an intuitive sense of just volumes in line and can just create these things, and you can model them exactly that way, and you would be shocked as a modeler, as a sculptor, at how precisely he had considered it. But then there's other artists who use line in a completely different way. So I'm thinking of examples like Mike Mignola. And Mike works in complete abstract, and he loves, it seems, to, especially some of his most iconic work, is about the two-dimensional graphic page. It's about looking at a piece of paper and arranging colors and shapes and lines around it that communicate super clearly, but in terms of interpreting it in dimension, you'd be completely lost. It's not a concern of his artwork to create an illusion of dimension. So it doesn't need to be yours. So this video is not meant to be a prescription of this is what you should do and this is the best way to make art. It's just, if this is an interest of yours and something you want to toy with and communicate in your work, here's a way of potentially doing it. One thing that I've talked about before online and in a couple of examples, we've jumped ahead in time here, I apologize, has been the sort of soft and hard edge. If you look in the middle of the screen on her skirt, there's a fold. And that fold has one crisp edge on its bottom and fades softly at the top of it. If you look closely at this finished piece, you'll notice a lot of examples of that, where there are sharp folds, creases, and then soft fall off. In her hair, that happens a lot, right? There's strands and sort of cuts of dimension that I'm making, and then soft fall off. And the softness communicates that a form is rounding off. And the sharpness communicates like a crease. And that seems obvious, but for whatever reason, that's been like a huge revelation for me in my work. I used to just go at things with straight lines and with blurry lines, and I didn't know the difference or why I was using one over the other. And something changed. It was other people's work I was looking at. It was part of a process of trying to communicate volume, where I realized, even as we're looking at her hand right here, that as it rounds her finger, the light sort of fades off of it because the surface doesn't provide it a hard crease to create a single cell shaded line. So as you move away from just a purely cell shaded mentality, at least that's where I came from, um, starting to realize that the edge quality, uh, edge control, um, can be huge in terms of communicating, yeah, volume and just the sense of light, um, and understanding in theory, but also just by practicing it, when a hard edge versus when a soft edge are appropriate, um, is great. And I think that largely you learn it by practice. And you can learn it by practice by creating a complex abstract volume, like a crinkled piece of paper or a wad of cloth or blankets, and trying to study the way the shadows move across those. Even just from a photo, if you take a photo of a crumpled blanket, you'll see the way that you understand it and sort of your eyes move across it and comprehend its volumes are soft and hard edges. And that's what determines your understanding visually of the shape and arrangement of that cloth. So line's not all out here. I'm still going in, and in many of my pieces, if you look closely, there's a sort of a subtle mixture of line art and sort of more soft shading. Um, these little creases, like I was talking to you about ambient occlusion earlier, are indicative of those places where light can't be. The really fine creases that her knuckles, this little lip of her scarf sort of folding over itself, as her fist rounds the little like kind of crease where the finger meets the palm. All these little spaces are places where you might consider the lines that I'm creating to be ambient occlusion sort of stand-ins, essentially. Um, at the same time, her eyebrows are pretty purely line art. Her eyelashes are a line as well. You know, there are spaces where line is totally appropriate. Um, and I think that the volume around those things helps give those lines context and helps you understand what shape they are and where they're supposed to go. A lot of the 3D work that I'm involved in and that I help people create is often sort of targeted, at least has been targeted, um, towards making a 3D thing look kind of like a painted 2D thing. That's something a lot of people are always chasing and trying to figure out. A big factor in that is because that look can be timeless almost. It ages much better than when you're just chasing pure realism. Um, if you can make something look a little bit like a painting or like a cartoon, but move it like a 3D, then you have something that's going to stand the test of time much more elegantly than if you're just chasing a photorealistic look. So the work that I do and my style has evolved around my own desires and but also the needs of clients, and the jobs that I've worked on have influenced the way I approach my work. Um, and that has largely been sort of the navigating the space between what looks 3D versus what looks painted in 2D. So ultimately, in the end, the end result, the goal here is to create something that doesn't necessarily look like a super shiny, slick 3D model per se, but looks like a painting with the feeling of volume and something that you could see potentially in a 3D show or movie. So right around here, going in, taking a look at the simple overlapping volumes of this her deer fox, trying to navigate that soft bean shape, figure out how much information to give the fur. As I do this, and as I'm talking about those particular that nexus between 3D and 2D, one of the favorite examples I have in mind always is the sort of vinyl toy look, kind of a matte finish. And I really like when my work comes out looking as though it were kind of a cleanly sculpted art toy. um, Another look that I really like in 3D that has that kind of feeling is the Disney Infinity look. Um, those sculptures have a beautiful sense of hard and soft volume. They have a great mix of round shapes and crisp edges that just comes together beautifully, and you get a really good feeling and sense, and every interpretation of the characters like treads a really good line between sort of cartoon and three-dimensional sculpture. So right here too, one thing I really like is you may see it again. I think you'll probably move the canvas around a little bit, but the shape as the shadow becomes really crisp, right where it connects on the haunch of his back leg with his sort of body, and then the softer shape as it kind of moves into the meat of the back leg. And I'm so trying to like use non-creepy words to describe this adorable cartoon character's anatomy, but it gets hard to do after a while. You're just searching for synonyms for haunch and meat. Um, my apologies. Um, Now I'm thinking that I would really like some turkey. Some of the understanding of these things is just built in from study, too. And I wish there were a silver bullet or something very simple and quippy I could say that would make things easier. But the only reason I know what a deer's ear looks like is from drawing a deer's ear. And looking at what a photo of that is and how the light falls across a shape like that. There's there are ways of understanding these things that you just get out of practice. You understand similar volumes and you can apply that to what you're doing. And then there are just facts where points at which you just have to have studied it and drawn it a couple times to get it and understand it. And that process, it sounds frustrating or vague, but it's just as simple as the beginning of this video where I looked at Hilda's 2D design and uh, drew it, traced it, just kind of studied it with my pencil. Um, Tracing from reference is a totally viable way of understanding and learning the shape and volume of something that you want to understand. So I would never judge anybody unless you were posting it as your own artwork and claiming it was original. But tracing stuff as a form of study is super useful. So another thing that I love to do, and it's quite frustrating, I think, sometimes for my coworkers, is even though I'm trying to make this clear for a 3D artist, I'm also like really drawn to some of the abstractions that shadows can create. So I love when uh, aspects of a character just fall completely into shadow, and you can't see every detail of his the fur around his collar or where his arm begins and ends because the shadows are obscuring parts of it, and kind of I think that's kind of a dreamy look. I really enjoy doing that, but I also realize that sometimes for my viewers and certainly for my coworkers and people who have to interpret these, that can be very frustrating. Um, so you see me right now. I'm trying to balance out like what I like about that, but still like making sure that somebody who's looking at this for the first time knows what they're looking at. It might be very clear to me, oh, his arm's there and his other arm's there, and he's got like a ruff of fur around his neck that's abstracted into these like soft triangles, but I haven't drawn every edge of them. But that's not necessarily going to read for somebody else outside of my own head. So you may see me come back soon and kind of clarify with a second layer of shading some of those shapes and forms and what's overlapping what. But I'm always dancing with how much information to withhold, because I think that if you explain everything, you miss a couple opportunities for some of that natural kind of beauty of painting. I always love in watercolor how watercolor kind of pools together and creates these shapes that are, kind of abstract and shadowy and make things kind of dreamy and interesting that way. Well, it's kind of my way of imitating that watercolor feeling. And you'll notice that initially the shadows were all one color. I went in with a single color to kind of just focus on the shape and the edge control of each bit of the shadows. Now I lock the layer and I'm painting in a little gold, a little like darker pink, some kind of cyan, kind of light blue reflections, trying to get complexity of color into these shadows on this character. That's determined by a couple different things, and it's very subjective how you want to approach all of that. There's technical terms that I am really not qualified to speak to. Some of this stuff is just stuff I've internalized visually, but I wouldn't know how to, what name to call it, and I feel like I would sound like an idiot talking too much about anything beyond bounce light. I'm right on the edge when I say ambient occlusion, and then when it starts to get into like, I'm flooding the shadows with a fill light, it's like, no, you don't, Nick, you don't know about that, about what you're talking about. So I'm coloring them with a little more sort of internal glow. People love subsurface scattering as a term. If you look that up, that's a way that the light looks when it's passing through someone's fingers, like when your flashlight is behind your fingers and you can see the orange light, or when setting sun kind of catches someone's ear from behind and you get that warm glow. That's called subsurface scattering because the light is bouncing around inside the object and kind of creating a glow from within. So here's me meticulously adjusting those pupils. Now that it's not as sped up, you can see it's still sped up, but get a sense of how much attention goes into some of these details. But specifically with the eyes, you just, if they're wrong, then the whole piece is going to feel wrong. Adding shines. Shininess is not something that's innate to the original style of Hilda. There's not a lot of information about light in the style of the show, and I didn't want to go overboard with that here either. But a little bit of it helps us understand the dimension and puts it into that 3D movie looking space a little bit more. So here's that moment. I'm going back in to him and adding that second layer of shading that's just giving you a little more information, even though for me the first layer was probably enough. Just so that everybody understands what they're looking at, I'm going back in and getting a little more explicit with my shadows. This is actually like a second multiply layer on top of the original shadow layer. So I have 2 layers of shadowing that I can manipulate and color independently of each other. The thing about working with shapes that are this sort of basic and yeah, sort of simple volumes is that again, those little finesse things need to be just right. So it's very noticeable if a gradient is not quite describing the volume right. You really just want to hone that as you go. But there's no single trick to leap ahead with that. It's really trial and error. At least it has been for me. So learning how something is going to look is a matter of trying it out, and if it really sucks, then trying it out again. So I'm just going into the background, having gotten to a point on the characters where I'm pretty pleased with their sense of volume and space. Another aspect of working linelessly is that there's no outline to pop a character from the background. So when you're creating something with no lines, but you're doing it in a background space, you really want to be cognizant of, is the color contrast popping? You know, so the kind of greeny yellow of the background and the red of her boots is clashing in a good way, so that you can definitely see the boot. With the deer fox, wanting to make sure that the white is brighter. That's my wife drawing right over my piece. Little hello message. Wanted to make sure the white is brighter than the background and the darks that I'm using are just darker than the background so that at no point is it the exact same value and you just lose the shape entirely. I think it's quite complex, but it's also much more true to life in terms of the way we see things. And so it can be useful whether you decide to use that going forward or not. This crow, I had the hardest time placing and scaling the crow in the sky. Wasn't sure. In the show, the crow's quite large, uh, but now he's in the distance, and I wanted to make sure he looked like he was flying on the same kind of plane as them, but I didn't want to put so much work into it that it got distracting, and ultimately I just kind of faded him pretty far back and redrew him once or twice just to get it right. Of course, the Midnight Giant. Key thing about creating things in a distance like that. I mean, the blurring is one thing, absolutely, but level of detail is another topic, maybe for another time. But trying to make sure you're controlling the scale of the details you're placing on things. Different sizes of brushstroke can really affect how big you feel a thing is. I believe I talked about that in a separate video, but that's another thing to keep your eye on. Anyways, this is about to draw to a conclusion. I really hope this was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, you guys, and thank you again for all your support. Cheers! See you in a bit.